The whispers followed Eleanor Prescott like storm clouds as she crossed the dusty main street of Walla Walla, Washington Territory, in the autumn of 1878. Women clutched their shawls tighter. Men touched the brims of their hats and stepped aside, all wearing expressions that mingled pity with something darker: fear, perhaps, or superstition. Behind gloved hands and half-closed shutters, they murmured the same refrain. 3 husbands in 5 years, all dead before their time, not a one from natural causes. Eleanor kept her head high despite the ache in her heart. At 26, she had already buried more men than most women would in a lifetime. First Thomas, killed in a mining accident barely a year after their wedding. Then William, thrown from his horse during a thunderstorm 2 years later. And most recently Edward, who'd succumbed to a mysterious fever that the doctor couldn't explain, just 6 months after they'd exchanged vows. The general store bell jangled as Eleanor stepped inside, and the cheerful conversation between Mr. Holloway and a customer halted abruptly. The stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, with a well-worn Stetson, turned toward her. Their eyes met briefly before Mr. Holloway cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, his voice unnaturally formal. "Your order's ready, just finished packing it up." "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the familiar tension that filled the room. She approached the counter, aware of the stranger's eyes following her movement. His gaze felt different from the others, curious rather than judgmental. Mr. Holloway pushed her parcel across the counter, careful that their fingers wouldn't touch, as if widowhood were contagious. "That'll be $1.45. Eleanor counted out the coins precisely, setting them on the wooden surface rather than handing them directly to the shopkeeper. It was a ritual she'd perfected over time, a small dignity in the face of their superstitions. "You're the widow Prescott." The stranger's deep voice startled her. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his eyes, kind eyes, surprisingly blue against his sun-darkened skin. He wasn't young, perhaps mid-30s, but he stood with the ease of a man comfortable in his own body. "I am," Eleanor answered, bracing herself for what might come next. Sometimes it was awkward sympathy, other times barely disguised accusation. "Owen Harrington," he said, extending his hand without hesitation. "Just rode into town yesterday, looking for work and a place to settle for a spell." Eleanor stared at his outstretched hand, so accustomed to people avoiding her touch that the simple gesture seemed revolutionary. After a moment's pause, she took it. His palm was calloused but warm, his grip firm without being crushing. "A pleasure, Mr. Harrington," she said, withdrawing her hand and gathering her parcel. "Welcome to Walla Walla." Mr. Holloway made a strangled sound. "Mr. Harrington, you're new here, so you wouldn't know, but folks around these parts are careful around Mrs. Prescott. Is that right?" Owen asked, his gaze not leaving Eleanor's face. "And why might that be?" "She's buried 3 husbands," Mr. Holloway said, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that everyone in the small store could hear clearly. "Town's starting to think she's cursed." Eleanor felt heat rising to her face, a mixture of shame and anger that never seemed to fade no matter how many times she endured these comments. Before she could respond, Owen Harrington's laughter filled the store, a genuine, deep sound that seemed to chase away the heaviness in the air. "Cursed," he repeated, shaking his head. "I've seen curse work in my travels, Mr. Holloway, and this lady doesn't have the look of it." He turned back to Eleanor, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "If anything, seems to me like you're the one who's had the bad luck, Mrs. Prescott." Eleanor couldn't remember the last time someone had defended her, even in this small way. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington, but I really must be going." She moved toward the door, parcel clutched tightly to her chest, when Owen's voice stopped her again. "Actually, Mrs. Prescott, I heard you might be looking for help at your place. I'm handy with tools and animals alike. I'd be grateful for the work." The store fell silent. Eleanor turned slowly. "Who told you I needed help?" "Livery stable owner mentioned it when I boarded my horse," Owen replied easily. "Said you had a small ranch outside town that's been getting run down without a man's hands to maintain it." "Mr. Wilson should mind his own affairs," Eleanor said stiffly, though it was true. The ranch had belonged to her first husband, Thomas. She'd managed to keep it through all 3 marriages, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain alone. Hired hands rarely stayed long once the whispers reached them. "With respect, madam," Owen continued, "I don't spook easy and I need the work. Whatever folks say about you doesn't concern me." Mr. Holloway cleared his throat again. "Mr. Harrington, you might want to reconsider. The last man who worked for Mrs. Prescott was paid fairly for honest work," Eleanor cut in sharply, "and left of his own accord when he found better employment in Spokane." She looked directly at Owen, measuring him. He met her gaze steadily. "If you're serious, Mr. Harrington, I could use help with the south fence and the barn roof before winter. Room and board plus $2 a week." $3, he countered, "and I'll have that roof fixed before the next rain." Despite herself, Eleanor felt a smile tug at her lips. $2.50, and we have an agreement." "Done," Owen nodded, satisfied. "I'll collect my things from the hotel and be out by afternoon if that suits." The bell above the door jingled as another customer entered, stopping short at the tableau before them. Mrs. Gray, the banker's wife, clutched her reticule tighter upon seeing Eleanor. "Eleanor Prescott," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "I didn't expect to see you in town so soon after poor Edward's passing." "Life continues, Mrs. Gray," Eleanor replied evenly, "as do the chores and the need for supplies." She nodded toward Owen. "This is Mr. Harrington. He'll be working at my ranch." Mrs. Gray's eyes widened as she took in Owen's tall frame. "Will he indeed? How brave of him!" She lowered her voice, though not enough. "Although I feel I should warn you, young man, they say the widow Prescott is cursed. 3 husbands dead, each more mysteriously than the last." Owen settled his hat more firmly on his head. "Then it's fortunate I'm being hired as a ranch hand and not a husband, isn't it, madam?" He smiled, but there was steel beneath it. "Unless you believe curses are contagious, Mrs. Gray sputtered while Eleanor felt a peculiar warmth spread through her chest. She nodded farewell to Owen. "I'll expect you this afternoon, Mr. Harrington." She stepped into the sunshine, her steps lighter than they had been in months. For the first time since Edward's death, she felt something other than grief and isolation, a tiny spark of hope, perhaps, or simply appreciation for a moment of dignity restored. As Eleanor loaded her parcel into her small wagon, she heard the store door open behind her. "Mrs. Prescott," Owen called, crossing the street toward her. When he reached the wagon, he lowered his voice. "I wanted to say, away from prying ears, that I meant what I said in there. I don't put stock in town gossip or superstition." Eleanor studied him, trying to discern his true intentions. "Why would you want to work for me when everyone else in town crosses the street to avoid me?" Owen's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Maybe because I've been on the receiving end of people's judgments before, and I know how rarely they get the story right." He gestured to a long scar that ran from his temple into his hairline. "Got this defending a friend in a saloon fight years back. Some towns I ride in and they take one look and decide I'm trouble." "And are you?" Eleanor asked. "Trouble?" Owen laughed. "No more than most, I suppose. But I am a hard worker and I keep my promises." He stepped back from the wagon. I'll be along by 4 if that's acceptable. Eleanor nodded, gathering the reins. The ranch is 3 miles east of town, just past the creek crossing. You can't miss it. As she drove away, Eleanor caught sight of Mrs. Gray and several other townsfolk watching from the boardwalk, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. She lifted her chin and snapped the reins, sending the wagon rolling faster down the rutted street. For 5 years, she had endured their whispers and sideways glances. 5 years of being the town's cautionary tale. Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of Owen Harrington's straightforward manner, but one thing was certain: it felt good to be treated like a person again, not a curse. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Eleanor hung the last of the laundry on the line. The white sheets billowed in the breeze, a stark contrast against the weathered gray of the barn beyond. She wiped her hands on her apron, surveying her small kingdom with a critical eye. Thomas had been so proud when he'd built this place, starting with just the modest cabin and gradually adding the barn, chicken coop, and corral. The fruit trees he'd planted were bearing now apples and pears that she'd been canning for weeks. A good harvest, at least, even if everything else needed attention. The sound of hoofbeats drew her gaze to the road. Owen Harrington approached on a sturdy bay gelding, saddlebags and a bedroll secured behind him. He rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. Eleanor smoothed her hair, suddenly conscious of her work-worn appearance, the simple brown dress, the loose strands escaping her practical bun, the smudge of dirt she could feel on her cheek. It had been a long time since she'd cared what anyone thought of her looks. "Afternoon, Mrs. Prescott," Owen called as he rode into the yard. He dismounted in one fluid motion, taking in the property with an appraising gaze. "You've got a fine place here." "It's seen better days," Eleanor admitted, "but the land is good." Owen nodded, leading his horse closer. "Land's what matters in the end. Buildings can always be fixed." He patted the gelding's neck. "This is Rusty. He's a good horse, though he has opinions about everything." As if on cue, the horse nudged Owen's shoulder with his nose. Eleanor found herself smiling at the pair. "There's a stall ready in the barn. Water trough is full, and I've got some oats set aside." "Much obliged." Owen glanced toward the cabin. "And for me?" "The room off the kitchen," Eleanor said. "It's small but has its own entrance, so you'll have your privacy. My husband Thomas built it for hired hands when he was planning to expand the ranch." She led the way across the yard, pointing out the vegetable garden, the chicken coop, and the smokehouse as they went. "Supper's at 6. Nothing fancy, but there's plenty." "Sounds perfect," Owen replied, falling into step beside her. "If you don't mind my asking, how long have you been managing alone?" Eleanor stiffened slightly. "Edward, my last husband, passed 6 months ago, but even when I was married, this place was more mine than theirs. William was the town's schoolteacher. Edward worked at the bank. Neither had much interest in ranching." Owen seemed to consider this. "And yet you stayed here rather than living in town." "This land is all I have left of Thomas," Eleanor said softly. "He's the one who wanted this life. The others—" She trailed off, then squared her shoulders. "Well, that's all in the past now." They reached the cabin, and Eleanor showed Owen to his quarters, a simple room with a narrow bed, a small table, and a chest for his belongings. A window looked out toward the mountains to the east. "This will do nicely," Owen said, setting his saddlebags on the bed. "If it's all the same to you, I'd like to have a look at that barn roof before sundown. Best to know what supplies we'll need." Eleanor nodded, relieved at his practicality. "I'll show you where the tools are kept." By the time supper was ready, Owen had already assessed the major repairs needed and started cleaning out the gutters that channeled rainwater from the roof to the collection barrel. He washed up at the pump outside, and Eleanor noticed that he'd changed into a clean shirt before coming to the table, a small courtesy that spoke of good upbringing. Over a simple meal of rabbit stew and cornbread, they discussed the work priorities. Owen was knowledgeable and direct, offering suggestions without being presumptuous. It was the most normal conversation Eleanor had experienced in months, with no undercurrent of pity or judgment. "Tomorrow I'll ride into town for lumber and roofing nails," Owen said, accepting a second helping of stew. "This is excellent, by the way. Thank you." Eleanor found herself unusually flustered by the compliment. "There's a family of rabbits that's been decimating my garden. Seemed only fair they should contribute to the larder." Owen chuckled. "Justice served with gravy. I approve." As they ate, Eleanor found herself curious about this man who had walked so casually past all the town's warnings. "Where were you before Walla Walla, Mr. Harrington?" "Owen, please," he corrected gently. "I was up in Montana for a spell, worked a silver mine then as a trail guide. Before that, all over, I suppose. Colorado, Wyoming, a bit of time in California during the gold rush days. You've seen a lot of the country, too much of it, maybe." Something in his tone suggested a weariness with wandering. "I've been thinking it might be time to put down some roots." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "In Walla Walla, why not? It's growing, has good water, decent folk despite their superstitious tendencies." Owen smiled. "And the scenery's not bad either." His gaze held hers a moment too long, and Eleanor looked away, busying herself with clearing the plates. It had been a long time since a man had looked at her with anything but caution or curiosity about her so-called curse. "Well," she said finally, "Walla Walla could use more people who think for themselves." After supper, Owen excused himself to tend to Rusty and check that the animals were secure for the night. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as his tall figure moved confidently around the barnyard in the gathering dusk. There was something reassuring about having another person on the property again, and unsettling too, after growing accustomed to solitude. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks of the cabin settling, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to Owen's easy manner and direct gaze. It was dangerous to feel this flicker of connection to someone who was only passing through her life, especially given her history. Better to keep things strictly professional between them. Still, as she drifted towards sleep, Eleanor couldn't help remembering how it felt when he'd shaken her hand in the store, the simple human contact that everyone else in town denied her. Whatever Owen Harrington's reasons for disregarding the whispers about her, she was grateful for his presence, temporary though it might be. Morning arrived with a spectacular sunrise painting the sky in streaks of pink and gold. Eleanor was already at the stove preparing breakfast when she heard Owen's footsteps on the porch. He knocked once before entering through the kitchen door, bringing the crisp autumn air with him. "Good morning," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "You're up early." "Farm hours," Eleanor replied, sliding biscuits into the oven. "Coffee's ready if you'd like some." Owen poured himself a cup, inhaling the steam appreciatively. Nothing better than coffee on a cool morning. He leaned against the doorframe, watching as she worked. "I checked the chicken coop at first light. You've got a fox problem." Eleanor sighed. "I suspected as much when I found feathers scattered by the woodpile yesterday. Lost 3 hens last week alone. I noticed some weak spots in the fencing. I can reinforce it today before I head into town for the roofing supplies." They settled into an easy routine over the next several days. Owen worked from sunrise to sunset, moving methodically through the most pressing repairs. The barn roof was patched, the chicken coop secured, and he'd begun replacing the rotted posts in the south fence line. Eleanor found herself looking forward to their conversations over meals, where Owen would share stories from his travels while she offered insights about the area and its history. Despite her initial reservations, Eleanor had to admit that having Owen around made the ranch feel alive again. The constant sound of hammering, the sight of fresh-cut lumber being transformed into solid structures, even Rusty's occasional nickering to the two mares in the corral, it all created a sense of renewal that had been missing for too long. On Saturday morning, a week after Owen's arrival, Eleanor was harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes when she heard a wagon approaching. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron, and felt a knot form in her stomach as she recognized Sheriff Miller's buggy. The sheriff wasn't alone. Beside him sat Reverend Porter, whose expression was even more grave than usual. Eleanor glanced toward the barn where Owen was working, then walked to meet the visitors. "Sheriff." "Reverend," she greeted them, keeping her voice neutral. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Miller removed his hat, revealing thinning hair slicked with pomade. "Mrs. Prescott, just making our rounds, checking on outlying properties." His eyes shifted past her to where the new fence posts stood in a neat row. "I see you've hired help." "Mr. Harrington has been very industrious," Eleanor replied evenly. "The place needed attention." Reverend Porter cleared his throat. "Eleanor, we're concerned about your welfare." "A woman alone with a stranger—" "I'm hardly alone, Reverend," Eleanor interrupted. "We have neighbors within shouting distance, and I've managed quite well these past months." "That's not quite what I meant," the Reverend said, his thin lips pressing together. "There are appearances to consider propriety." Eleanor felt heat rise to her face. "Mr. Harrington has his own quarters with a separate entrance. There's nothing improper about our arrangement." Sheriff Miller shifted uncomfortably. "It's just that folks in town are talking, Mrs. Prescott. You know how they are. First it was about well, your unfortunate history with husbands. Now it's about you living out here with a drifter nobody knows." "Owen Harrington is my employee," Eleanor said firmly. "He's done nothing to warrant suspicion." "That may be," Reverend Porter conceded, "but given your circumstances, you must be particularly careful about your reputation. The Lord teaches us that appearances of evil— Can I help you gentlemen with something?" All three turned to see Owen approaching, hammer still in hand. His expression was pleasant enough, but Eleanor noted the tension in his shoulders. Sheriff Miller straightened. "Just paying a friendly visit to Mrs. Prescott here." "Is that right?" Owen came to stand beside Eleanor, not crowding her but clearly aligning himself with her. "Seems to me Mrs. Prescott might have better uses for her mourning than entertaining visitors who question her judgment." Reverend Porter bristled. "Now see here, young man, Owen Harrington," Owen supplied, extending his hand, which the Reverend reluctantly shook. "I understand you're concerned for Mrs. Prescott's well-being. That's commendable. But I can assure you she's perfectly safe, and I'm here simply to help restore this fine ranch to working order." The sheriff studied Owen with narrowed eyes. "Where did you say you were from, Harrington?" "I didn't," Owen replied easily. "But I most recently worked in Montana. Before that, all over. I'm happy to answer any questions you have." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them until Eleanor broke it. "Sheriff, Reverend, I appreciate your concern, but I have work to do, unless there's an official reason for this visit." The men exchanged glances before Sheriff Miller replaced his hat. "No, nothing official, just looking out for one of our own." "Then I thank you for your vigilance and bid you good day," Eleanor said with finality. After the buggy had disappeared down the drive, Owen turned to her with a raised eyebrow. "Does this happen often?" Eleanor sighed, suddenly tired. "Not exactly like this. But yes, they check on me. Sometimes I think they're just waiting for me to give up and leave town so they can stop worrying about the curse spreading. Owen's jaw tightened. These decent folk of Walla Walla are starting to seem less decent by the day. They're afraid, Eleanor said softly. Fear makes people cruel sometimes. Fear of what? That you'll marry them next. Owen shook his head in disbelief. Despite everything, Eleanor laughed a genuine, surprised sound that felt foreign to her throat. I think that's exactly it. The first death could be explained as bad luck. The second raised eyebrows, but after Edward. She trailed off, her amusement fading. After Edward, they decided you were the common factor, Owen finished for her. Rather than recognizing that tragedy sometimes strikes the same person multiple times. He studied her face. You don't believe you're cursed, do you? Eleanor hesitated. Most days, no. But sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I wonder if they might be right. 3 good men, all gone. What are the odds? Owen stepped closer, his expression earnest. Life isn't about odds, Eleanor. It's about weathering whatever comes your way. And from what I've seen, you're stronger than anyone gives you credit for, including yourself. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and somehow it felt right. Eleanor met his gaze, finding nothing but sincere admiration there. Thank you, Owen. He nodded once, then gestured toward the barn. Now, I'd better get back to those fence posts before the sheriff returns with reinforcements to protect you from my dangerous hammering skills. Eleanor smiled, feeling the weight of the encounter lifting from her shoulders. As she watched Owen walk away, she realized that in just 1 week, he had done more than repair her property. He had begun to repair her belief in her own worth. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Eleanor found the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her. Aren't you worried about what they say? About the curse? Owen took his time answering, sipping the coffee she'd brought out for them both. I've never been much concerned with what others think, and in my experience, most so-called curses are just bad luck paired with people's need to find patterns where none exist. He set his cup down on the porch railing. Besides, I'm not planning on proposing marriage, so I should be safe enough. His eyes crinkled with humor as he glanced at her. Unless you've branched out to cursing ranch hands as well, Eleanor shook her head, smiling despite herself. Not yet. Though if you keep making jokes about it, I might reconsider. Their laughter mingled in the evening air, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor felt the hard shell around her heart begin to soften, just a little. October deepened into November, bringing cooler temperatures and the first hints of winter on the horizon. Owen had completed most of the urgent repairs, and moved on to improvements reinforcing the barn door that had always stuck in damp weather, building a new feed trough for the horses, constructing shelves in the root cellar to better organize Eleanor's preserved foods. Each day, Eleanor found herself looking forward to their shared meals and conversations. Owen was well read for a man who'd spent his life on the move, and they discovered a mutual appreciation for Shakespeare and Dickens. Sometimes in the evenings, one would read aloud while the other mended clothes or cleaned tools. The weekly trips to town for supplies became a joint endeavor, with Owen driving the wagon and Eleanor gradually reintroducing herself to the community. With Owen beside her, the whispers seemed less potent, though they didn't stop entirely. Did you see? The widow's got herself a new man. Wonder how long this one will last before the curse takes him. I give it till Christmas at most. One crisp Tuesday in mid-November, they were loading supplies when Mrs. Gray approached them outside the mercantile, her face a mask of concerned disapproval. Eleanor, she said, pointedly ignoring Owen. I was just speaking with Reverend Porter about you yesterday. He's quite concerned about your spiritual well-being, given your situation. Eleanor arranged her features into a polite smile. That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Gray, but I assure you my relationship with God remains intact despite my losses. Yes, well. Mrs. Gray leaned closer, lowering her voice. It's not just your past that concerns him. It's your current living arrangements. A widow alone with an unmarried man of questionable background. People are talking. Eleanor. Before Eleanor could respond, Owen stepped forward, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Mrs. Gray, isn't it? I believe we've met. I'm the man of questionable background you're referring to. Mrs. Gray straightened, clutching her purse tighter. Mr. Harrington, I was just expressing concern for Mrs. Prescott's reputation. How kind, Owen replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. Though I can't help but wonder why you're more worried about appearances than about her having safe shelter and enough food for winter. Seems to me a truly caring community would offer help rather than judgment. Mrs. Gray's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Well, I never know. I don't suppose you have, Owen agreed pleasantly. Mrs. Prescott, I believe we have everything on our list. Shall we? As they drove away, Eleanor found herself torn between mortification and a strange, bubbling laughter. You shouldn't have spoken to her that way, she said, though without conviction. Mrs. Gray's husband owns the bank. They have influence in town. Owen shrugged. Perhaps, but someone needed to say it. He glanced at her. Does it bother you what they say? Eleanor considered the question. It used to devastate me. Now. She looked out at the rolling hills beyond the town, feeling the gentle sway of the wagon beneath her. Now I'm starting to care less about their opinions and more about my own peace. Owen nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. That sounds like progress to me. As they left town, neither noticed Sheriff Miller watching their departure with a troubled expression, or that he immediately headed toward the telegraph office with purposeful strides. The weather turned sharply colder that night. Eleanor added an extra quilt to her bed and banked the stove carefully before retiring. She was just drifting to sleep when a sharp crack jolted her awake, the unmistakable sound of a branch breaking under the weight of ice. She lit a lamp and peered out the window. The maple tree that stood near the corner of the house had indeed lost a significant limb, which now lay across the path to the barn. More concerning was the thin sheen of ice forming on everything the freezing rain touched. A tap at her door startled her. Eleanor! Owen's voice was low but urgent. Are you awake? She grabbed her shawl, wrapping it around her nightdress before opening the door. Owen stood there in trousers and an undershirt, clearly having dressed hastily. The horses, he said without preamble. If this ice storm gets worse, the barn roof could be compromised, especially the north corner we haven't reinforced yet. Eleanor nodded. I'll dress and help you move them to the lower shelter. 10 minutes later, they were carefully making their way across the icy yard, lanterns casting long shadows. The freezing rain stung Eleanor's face as they worked to lead the nervous horses, Eleanor's 2 mares, and Owen's gelding, from the main barn to the sturdier storage shed near the house. The animals were skittish, sensing the danger in the creaking timbers overhead. As they guided the last mare across the yard, a sound like a gunshot rang out, another branch giving way, this one from the old oak that towered over the barn. Look out! Owen shouted, lunging forward to pull Eleanor and the horse clear as the massive limb crashed down exactly where they had been standing seconds before. They stumbled backward, Owen's arms still around Eleanor as they struggled to keep their footing on the ice. The mare whinnied in panic, pulling free and bolting toward the open door of the shed. Owen's quick reflexes saved them from falling, but the momentum sent them against the barn wall, Eleanor's back pressed against the rough wood, Owen's body unexpectedly close. For a breathless moment they stayed that way, the lantern light catching the ice crystals in Owen's hair, his face inches from hers. Eleanor became acutely aware of his hands on her shoulders, the warmth of him even through the cold, the way his eyes reflected the golden light. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice husky. Eleanor nodded, unable to form words. Something had changed in that instant, a shift as palpable as the electricity in the storm-charged air. Owen must have felt it too, for he stepped back slowly, his hands lingering before dropping to his sides. "We should secure the horses," he said, breaking the spell. "And check that branch didn't damage the barn wall." They worked in charged silence, each hyper-aware of the other's movements. When the animals were safely settled, they made their way back to the house, the freezing rain having temporarily subsided. At the porch steps, they paused. "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "If you hadn't reacted so quickly." "Just doing my job," Owen replied, though they both knew it was more than that. He hesitated, then added, "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Owen." Later, lying awake in her bed listening to the ice tapping against the window panes, Eleanor faced an uncomfortable truth. She was falling for Owen Harrington. Against all her better judgment, despite the warnings of the town, despite her own history of loss, her heart was reaching toward him like a flower turning to the sun. It was foolish, dangerous even. Owen was her employee, a drifter by his own admission, and likely to move on once the major repairs were complete. And even if he did harbor feelings for her, the shadow of her so-called curse hung over any potential relationship. Eleanor pressed her hands to her eyes, willing these inconvenient emotions away. She wouldn't allow herself to care for another man who might be taken from her. And yet, as sleep finally claimed her, her dreams were filled with the warmth of Owen's arms and the question in his eyes before he'd stepped away. Morning revealed a crystalline world, every branch and fence post encased in ice that sparkled in the weak November sunshine. The damage was considerable but not catastrophic. Several more broken branches, a section of fence flattened, but the buildings had weathered the storm intact. Owen was already assessing the situation when Eleanor emerged from the house. They greeted each other with a careful formality that acknowledged the previous night's unspoken moment. "The worst seems to have passed," Owen observed, nodding toward the clear blue sky. "Though we'll need to clear those branches before the next storm." They worked together throughout the day, falling into their familiar rhythm despite the new awareness humming between them. By afternoon, they had cleared the largest debris and ensured the animals were comfortable in their temporary quarters. As the sun began its early winter descent, Owen chopped firewood while Eleanor prepared supper. The domestic scene would have appeared ordinary to any observer, but to Eleanor, everything felt heightened. The sound of the axe striking wood outside, the steam rising from the stew pot, even the colors of the sunset seemed more vibrant. They were halfway through their meal when the sound of approaching horses broke the evening quiet. Owen rose, moving to the window with the wariness of a man accustomed to unexpected trouble. "Sheriff Miller," he reported, his voice tight, "and two men I don't recognize." Eleanor joined him at the window, her stomach nodding as she watched the three riders dismount. "The one with the handlebar mustache is Deputy Jones. I don't know the other man." The knock, when it came, was sharp and official. Owen opened the door, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor in a gesture that might have been unconscious but spoke volumes. "Evening, Sheriff," Owen said evenly. "What brings you out in this weather?" Sheriff Miller's gaze moved between them, taking in their proximity and the dinner table set for two. "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Prescott, sorry to disturb your supper, but we have some business to discuss." He gestured to the stranger, a weathered man in a duster coat with a U.S. Marshall's badge pinned to his vest. "This is Marshall Thornton from Spokane." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Please come in, gentlemen. Can I offer you coffee?" The men entered but declined refreshments. Marshall Thornton stepped forward, his hard eyes fixed on Owen. "Owen Harrington, I have some questions regarding your whereabouts on September 18th of this year." Owen's expression remained neutral, but Eleanor noticed his hands tense at his sides. "I was in Montana, working a silver mine outside Helena." "Can anyone vouch for that?" the marshal pressed. "The foreman, Jack Wilkins. Several of the men I worked alongside." Marshal Thornton exchanged glances with Sheriff Miller. "The reason I ask, Mr. Harrington, is that a man fitting your description was involved in a stagecoach robbery near Coeur d'Alene on that date. A guard was shot." Eleanor's breath caught. She looked at Owen, who appeared surprised but not afraid. "I haven't been in Idaho since spring," Owen said firmly, "and I've never robbed anyone in my life, let alone shot a guard." Sheriff Miller stepped forward. "We received a telegraph from the Spokane office asking about new arrivals matching your description. Tall, dark hair, scar near the temple, riding a bay gelding." Owen's hand went instinctively to the scar on his hairline. "This is a mistake. That description could fit dozens of men." "Perhaps," Marshal Thornton conceded. "But given that you appeared in town shortly after the robbery, with no clear background and ready cash to spend, you can understand our interest." "Ready cash," Eleanor interjected. "Owen arrived looking for work because he needed money." The marshal's gaze shifted to her. "Madam, with all due respect, how well do you really know this man?" The question hit Eleanor like a physical blow. How well did she know Owen? She knew he was kind, hardworking, that he treated her with respect when others didn't. She knew the sound of his laughter and the steadiness of his hands. But his past before Walla Walla remained largely a mystery by his own choice. Owen seemed to read her uncertainty. "I have nothing to hide," he said, addressing all of them. "I've worked honest jobs my whole life. I can provide names of previous employers. And the money I arrived with came from my wages at the silver mine, barely enough to keep me for a week at the hotel." Marshal Thornton remained unconvinced. "Mr. Harrington, I'm going to need you to come with us to town for further questioning. If your story checks out, you'll be free to return." "This is ridiculous," Eleanor protested. "You can't just take him on such flimsy evidence." "It's all right, Eleanor," Owen said quietly. "I'll go answer their questions. The sooner this misunderstanding is cleared up, the better." He turned to the lawman. "May I gather a few things?" Sheriff Miller nodded. "Deputy Jones will accompany you." As Owen and the deputy disappeared into his room, Eleanor faced the remaining men. "Sheriff Miller, you know this man has done nothing but improve my property and conduct himself honorably since arriving. Why would a stagecoach robber spend weeks fixing fences and barn roofs? People hide in plain sight all the time, Mrs. Prescott," Marshal Thornton answered for him. "And sometimes they find remote places to lie low until the heat dies down." Eleanor felt anger rising in her chest. "My ranch is hardly remote, Marshal. We're 3 miles from town on a well-traveled road." Sheriff Miller had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Eleanor, we're just doing our duty. If he's innocent, he has nothing to fear." Owen returned with his coat and hat, moving with a calm dignity that only increased Eleanor's distress. He paused before her. "I'll be back as soon as this is resolved," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Don't worry." But as Eleanor watched the 4 men ride away into the gathering darkness, worry was all she could do. Whatever was happening between her and Owen, this fragile, unnamed thing now faced a threat greater than town gossip or superstition. And the cold, hard fact remained that she knew very little about the man who had begun to claim her heart. Sleep proved elusive that night. Eleanor paced her small cabin, alternating between conviction in Owen's innocence and nagging doubt. What if the townspeople had been right to be suspicious of a stranger who arrived with few possessions and fewer explanations? What if she had been so desperate for kindness that she'd blinded herself to warning signs? No, she decided as dawn broke over the frost-covered fields. The Owen Harrington she had come to know, the man who reads Shakespeare by lamplight and fixed broken things with patient hands, was no thief or killer. His eyes held too much integrity for that. After feeding the animals and completing her morning chores, Eleanor hitched her wagon and drove to town, determination setting her jaw. The streets were quieter than usual, most people choosing to stay indoors after the ice storm. She tied her horses outside the sheriff's office and marched inside, prepared to argue for Owen's release. The office was empty except for Deputy Jones, who looked up from his paperwork with surprise. "Mrs. Prescott, the sheriff isn't here." "Where is he? And where is Mr. Harrington?" The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff and the marshal took him to Spokane on the morning train, wanted to check his story against witnesses there." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Spokane, but that's a day's journey. When will they return?" "Can't say for sure." "Depends on what they find, I reckon." Deputy Jones's expression softened slightly. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Prescott, your man didn't seem the type to rob stage coaches to me. Too steady." "He's not my man," Eleanor corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow. "He's my employee." The deputy's raised eyebrow suggested he didn't believe that any more than she did. Eleanor left the sheriff's office and walked numbly to the telegraph office. She sent wires to the silver mine in Helena and to the stagecoach company in Coeur d'Alene, requesting information that might help clear Owen's name. It was a small action, possibly futile, but it was all she could think to do. As she crossed the street toward the mercantile to purchase supplies, Eleanor became aware of the stares and whispers following her. News traveled fast in small towns, and clearly the arrest of her ranch hand was the latest chapter in the ongoing saga of the cursed widow. Inside the store, Mrs. Holloway greeted her with exaggerated sympathy. "Eleanor, dear, we just heard about your unfortunate situation." Again. Eleanor gritted her teeth, selecting flour and coffee with deliberate movements. "Nothing unfortunate has happened, Mrs. Holloway. Mr. Harrington is answering some questions and will return shortly." "Of course, dear." Mrs. Holloway's voice dripped with false compassion. "Though you must admit there's something peculiar about your luck with men. First 3 husbands, and now this drifter turning out to be a wanted criminal." Eleanor slammed the coffee tin down on the counter with more force than intended. "Owen Harrington is not a criminal. He's a good man who's been falsely accused based on a vague description that could match half the men in the territory." Mrs. Holloway stepped back, startled by the outburst. "Well, I was only expressing concern." "No," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. "You were gloating, Mrs. Holloway. This town has been waiting for the next tragedy to befall me since Edward died, and now you think you have it. But you're wrong. Owen is innocent, and he will return." The confidence in her voice surprised even herself. In that moment, Eleanor realized that whatever doubts had crept in during the night had evaporated in the face of others' eagerness to believe the worst. She paid for her purchases and left, head high despite the curious onlookers who had witnessed the exchange. As she loaded her wagon, Reverend Porter approached, Bible in hand. "Eleanor," he began, "in times of tribulation—" "Not today, Reverend," Eleanor cut him off. Unless you're here to offer actual help rather than scripture and judgment, I have a ranch to run." She drove home with a curious mixture of anger and determination fueling her. The ranch seemed emptier than ever without Owen's presence, but there was work to be done. The animals wouldn't feed themselves, and the ice storm damage still needed attention. That evening, as Eleanor ate her solitary supper, she found herself staring at Owen's empty chair and making a decision. If when he returned, she would no longer hide behind propriety or fear. Life had taught her the hard lesson that time was precious and uncertain. Whatever was growing between them deserved acknowledgement. Curse or no curse, 3 days passed with no word from Spokane. Eleanor kept the ranch running, splitting her own firewood, caring for the animals and making what repairs she could manage alone. Each day she drove to town to check for telegrams or news, and each day she returned disappointed. On the 4th day, as she was mending a tear in the chicken wire, the sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the road. Her heart leaped, then fell as she recognized Sheriff Miller's horse but not Owen. The sheriff dismounted, looking weary from travel. "Mrs. Prescott." "Where is he?" Eleanor asked without preamble. Sheriff Miller removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "That's what I've come to tell you. There's been a development." Fear clutched at Eleanor's throat. "Is he hurt? Has something happened?" "No, nothing like that," the sheriff sighed. "The fact is, Mrs. Prescott, it appears we were mistaken." The silver mine foreman confirmed Harrington's alibi, and a witness from the stagecoach robbery identified another man entirely when presented with several photographs. Relief flooded through Eleanor so strongly that she had to grip the fence post for support. "So he's innocent, as I said all along. Where is he now? Why didn't he return with you?" A flicker of discomfort crossed the sheriff's face. "That's the thing, Mrs. Prescott. He was released yesterday morning with our apologies. But instead of returning directly, he said he had business to attend to in Spokane. Wouldn't specify what." Eleanor frowned, confusion replacing relief. "Business? What kind of business would he have there?" "I couldn't say. But he asked me to deliver this." Sheriff Miller reached into his coat and withdrew a sealed envelope. "Said it would explain everything." Eleanor took the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. The sheriff shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with whatever messenger role he'd been assigned. "For what it's worth, Mrs. Prescott, I believe I misjudged Mr. Harrington. He conducted himself with dignity throughout the ordeal, never once lost his temper despite the circumstances. That says something about a man's character." Eleanor nodded absently, her attention fixed on the envelope. "Thank you for bringing this, Sheriff." After he rode away, Eleanor sat on the porch steps and broke the seal with unsteady fingers. Owen's handwriting was strong and clear, much like the man himself. "Dear Eleanor, by now the sheriff will have explained that the charges against me have been dropped. I'm grateful for the truth coming to light, though less pleased about the days spent in a Spokane jail cell. I should be returning to the ranch with this letter, but circumstances have arisen that require my attention here in Spokane. I can't explain everything in writing, but I promise I will return within a week to settle accounts and explain in person. The work we started together matters to me, as does your good opinion. Please know that my absence is not by choice but by necessity. Until I return." Owen Eleanor read the letter 3 times, trying to decipher meaning beyond the carefully chosen words. What circumstances could be so pressing? And what did he mean by settle accounts? Was he planning to leave permanently after returning? The thought sent a sharp pain through her chest. She had known from the beginning that Owen wasn't likely to stay. Forever drifters rarely did, but something in his manner these past weeks had suggested he might be ready to put down roots. Had she misread his intentions so completely? As the days passed with no further word from Owen, Eleanor threw herself into work with renewed vigor, as if physical exhaustion might quiet her troubled thoughts. She finished the repairs he had started, stubbornly refusing to acknowledge that she was preparing the ranch to withstand winter without his help. A week came and went. No Owen. No further letters. Eleanor made her daily trips to town, checking for telegrams, asking discreetly if anyone had news from Spokane. Nothing. 10 days after the sheriff's visit, as Eleanor was returning from town, she spotted a rider approaching from the east the opposite direction from Walla Walla. Her pulse quickened, but as the figure drew closer, she realized it wasn't Owen but a young boy, perhaps 14, riding a borrowed horse too large for his slight frame. "Mrs. Prescott," the boy called as he reached the yard. "I got a message for you from Mr. Harrington." Eleanor hurried forward. "Where is he? Is he all right?" The boy dismounted clumsily. "Yes, he's at the Fulton place about 8 miles east. Asked if you could come right away. Said it's important." The Fulton place was an abandoned homestead that had stood empty for years after the family moved on to Oregon. What could Owen possibly be doing there? Did he say why? Eleanor pressed. The boy shrugged. "No, madam. Just gave me 2 bits to deliver the message and said it was urgent-like." Eleanor hesitated only briefly. Whatever game Owen was playing, she wanted answers. "Wait here," she told the boy. "I'll fetch my horse and you can show me the way." 20 minutes later, they were riding east, the boy leading and Eleanor following with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The afternoon sun slanted through the bare trees, casting long shadows across the frost-hardened ground. The Fulton homestead came into view just as the sun touched the western hills, a simple cabin with a sagging porch, a weathered barn, and overgrown fields stretching toward the creek. Smoke rose from the chimney and a familiar bay gelding was tethered near the barn. "That's it, madam," the boy said unnecessarily. "Mr. Harrington's inside." Eleanor dismounted, handing the boy her reins. "Thank you for your help. Want me to wait?" "No," Eleanor decided, pulling her shawl tighter against the evening chill. "I believe I can find my way back." As the boy rode away, Eleanor approached the cabin with measured steps. Before she could knock, the door swung open and there stood Owen, looking tired but whole, his smile hesitant as he met her gaze. "Eleanor," he said softly, "thank you for coming." "You didn't give me much choice," she replied, suddenly aware of how angry she was beneath the relief. Disappearing for almost 2 weeks, then sending a cryptic message with a child. "What game are you playing, Owen?" His smile faded. "No game, I promise you that." He stepped back, gesturing for her to enter. "Please come in. There's someone I'd like you to meet." Confusion replaced anger as Eleanor crossed the threshold. The cabin's interior was sparse, but had been recently cleaned. A fire burned in the small hearth, and beside it, wrapped in blankets in a rocking chair, sat an elderly woman with Owen's blue eyes and a face mapped with wrinkles. "Mother," Owen said gently, "this is Eleanor Prescott, the lady I told you about." The woman's face brightened with a smile that transformed her frail features. "Ah, the widow with the lovely ranch. My son speaks very highly of you, Mrs. Prescott." Eleanor looked between them, momentarily speechless. Owen's mother, here in this abandoned homestead. "I apologize for the mystery," Owen continued, pulling out a chair for Eleanor. "But I needed to get things settled before I could explain." As Eleanor sat, he poured 3 cups of tea from a pot keeping warm on the hearth. "When I was in Spokane dealing with that false accusation, I received word that my mother had fallen ill in her boarding house in Seattle. The landlady telegraphed because I'd left her as an emergency contact when I passed through last spring." Owen's mother nodded. Owen's always been a good son, checking on me whenever his wandering brings him to the Northwest. I went straight to Seattle after being released, Owen explained. Mother's health was too fragile for her to remain alone in that boarding house, but she refused to enter the county home for the elderly. Dreadful places, the old woman interjected with surprising vigor. People go there to die, not to live. Owen smiled fondly at her before continuing. I needed to find a solution quickly. That's when I remembered the Fulton place. I'd passed it on my rides around the area and knew it was standing empty. I made inquiries in town and discovered the property is for sale at a price I could manage with my savings. Eleanor's mind raced to keep up. You bought this homestead, signed the papers yesterday, Owen confirmed. It needs work, but the structure is sound. Close enough to town for necessities, but with good land for a garden and a few animals. He met her eyes directly. And not too far from your ranch. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Owen wasn't leaving, he was putting down roots, just not at her ranch. I see, Eleanor said carefully. But why all the secrecy? Why not simply tell me what was happening? Owen's mother chuckled. My son has always had a flair for the dramatic, Mrs. Prescott. Gets it from his father, God rest his soul. That's not quite it, Mother, Owen said, a hint of color touching his cheeks. I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep. If the property had fallen through or if Mother's health had worsened. He shook his head. I needed to be sure before I said anything. Eleanor studied him, seeing the fatigue in the lines around his eyes, understanding dawning. You've been working to make this place habitable. Owen nodded. Day and night. It's still rough, but it's weather-tight and warm enough for now. He hesitated. I still intend to finish the work I started at your ranch, Eleanor. I don't break my promises. Always so serious, his mother remarked, sipping her tea. You can see why I worried about him being alone all these years, Mrs. Prescott. A man needs something to anchor him besides duty. Mother, Owen warned gently, but the old woman continued undeterred. When Owen told me about you and your ranch, I knew he'd found something worth staying for. First time in 20 years, I've seen him look at a map and think about here instead of elsewhere. Eleanor felt warmth rising to her face. Mrs. Harrington, please call me Martha. Mrs. Harrington makes me feel ancient and I'm only 72. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself smiling. Martha, then. Your son has been a tremendous help to me these past weeks. I'm grateful he'll be staying in the area. Owen watched this exchange with a mixture of embarrassment and affection. Mother needs to rest now, he said, noting how the elderly woman's eyelids had begun to droop. Would you help me settle her while I prepare her room? As Owen disappeared into the small bedroom, Eleanor helped Martha from the rocking chair. The old woman leaned on her arm, surprisingly light. He's a good man, my Owen, Martha said quietly. Too good to spend his life wandering from place to place with only his horse for company. Yes, Eleanor agreed. He is a good man. Martha patted her hand. And you're a good woman who's seen more than her share of sorrow from what he tells me. Perhaps together you might find something better than either of you has known alone. Before Eleanor could respond to this startlingly direct suggestion, Owen returned. Room's ready, Mother. Once Martha was settled, Owen and Eleanor returned to the main room. The air between them felt charged with unspoken words. I should be getting back, Eleanor said finally. It's nearly dark. I'll ride with you, Owen said immediately. The trail can be tricky at night. They prepared their horses in companionable silence, and soon were riding side by side through the twilight, the first stars appearing overhead. Your mother is remarkable, Eleanor said after a time. Owen smiled. She is. Raised me alone after my father died in a mining accident when I was 10. Taught school to support us. His expression grew serious. I've been sending her money over the years, but I should have settled somewhere sooner, given her a proper home for her final years. You're doing that now, Eleanor reminded him. That's what matters. They rode a little further before Owen spoke again. I want to apologize, Eleanor, not just for the mysterious departure, but for bringing all this upheaval into your life. The arrest, the gossip it must have caused in town. Eleanor shook her head. The town would have gossiped regardless. They always do. Still. Owen guided his horse closer to hers. I never meant to complicate things for you. Life is complicated, Owen. It doesn't wait for convenient moments or perfect circumstances. Eleanor looked at him directly. When you didn't return, I thought perhaps you'd decided the so-called curse wasn't worth the risk after all. Owen reined his horse to a stop, forcing Eleanor to do the same. In the deepening twilight, his expression was earnest, almost fierce. Is that what you think of me? That I'd let town superstition dictate my choices? I didn't know what to think, Eleanor admitted. You were gone with barely an explanation. I told you once that I don't believe in curses, Owen said quietly. I believe in people making their own luck, good or bad. And I believe that sometimes, when you've endured enough hardship, the universe finally decides to be kind. Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. And is that what you think is happening now? The universe being kind? Owen reached across the space between them, his hand finding hers. I think I rode into Walla Walla looking for work and found something I wasn't even searching for. His voice dropped lower. Something I've been running from for years without realizing it. And what's that? Eleanor asked, though she already knew the answer. A reason to stay, Owen replied simply. If you'll have me. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning beyond the professional relationship they'd maintained. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at Owen's face, finding only sincerity there. The work at the ranch isn't finished, she said softly, and winter's coming. Owen's smile was slow and warm. Is that a yes? Eleanor found herself smiling back, a lightness expanding in her chest that she hadn't felt in years. It's a start. As they resumed their journey through the starlit night, Eleanor felt something shifting within her, the heavy mantle of grief and isolation beginning to lift. Whatever came next, whether the town approved or not, she would face it beside this man who had walked fearlessly past her supposed curse and seen only a woman worth knowing. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Prescott looked toward the future with hope instead of dread. The days grew shorter as November deepened toward winter, but for Eleanor, life had never seemed fuller. Owen divided his time between preparing the Fulton place for the harsh months ahead and completing the promised work at her ranch. Often, he would bring Martha with him, the elderly woman sitting by the fire with her knitting while they worked, offering opinions and stories in equal measure. Slowly, the three of them formed a kind of family different from anything Eleanor had known before, but no less real for its unconventional nature. She found herself looking forward to Martha's sharp wit and surprising wisdom almost as much as Owen's steady presence. The town's reaction to these developments was predictably mixed. Some, like Reverend Porter, expressed concern about propriety, especially when it became known that Owen often stayed late at Eleanor's ranch, returning to the Fulton place after dark. "People will talk, Mrs. Gray warned her after church one Sunday, her tone suggesting they already were. "People have been talking about me for years, Mrs. Gray," Eleanor replied evenly. "I've discovered I can survive it." Others, particularly those who had business dealings with Eleanor, seemed to assess the situation with more pragmatic eyes. Mr. Wilson from the livery stable commented that her stock looked healthier than they had in years. while Mr. Holloway grudgingly admitted that the improvements to her property were substantial. "Though I still say it's peculiar," he added, unable to completely abandon the town's favorite subject of gossip. "Him setting up at the old Fulton place with his mother, yet spending most days at your ranch. Is it peculiar for neighbors to help one another, Mr. Holloway?" Eleanor asked with deliberate innocence. "I was under the impression that was the Christian thing to do." The shopkeeper had no ready answer for that. As December arrived with its first dusting of snow, Eleanor and Owen found themselves working side by side in her barn, preparing it for the coming winter. They had fallen into an easy rhythm together, anticipating each other's movements, sharing tasks without need for discussion. "Mother's been asking when you'll come for supper again," Owen mentioned as they spread fresh straw in the horse stalls. "She's planning to make her famous apple dumplings." Eleanor smiled, remembering the elderly woman's determination to prepare a special meal despite her arthritis. "Tell her I'll come tomorrow if that suits." Owen paused in his work, leaning on his pitchfork. "She's grown very fond of you, you know, and I of her," Eleanor replied honestly. "She reminds me of my grandmother, strong-willed and not afraid to speak her mind. That's putting it mildly." Owen chuckled. "Do you know what she said to me yesterday? 'Son, if you don't make your intentions clear to that woman soon, I'll do it for you.'" Eleanor felt her cheeks warm despite the chill in the barn. "Did she indeed?" Owen moved closer, setting aside the pitchfork. "She did. And she's right, as usual." He took Eleanor's gloved hands in his. "I've been trying to find the perfect moment, the perfect words, but maybe there aren't any." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Perfect moments are rare in my experience. Then perhaps we make them ourselves." Owen's blue eyes held hers steadily. "Eleanor, I love you. I think I started falling the moment you stood up to Mr. Holloway in the store that first day. I admired your courage then, but now I know your heart as well, its kindness, its resilience." Eleanor felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "Owen, the town, hang the town," he said gently. "I don't care what they whisper about curses or bad luck. I care about you, about us. 3 husbands," Eleanor whispered, giving voice to her deepest fear. "All gone too soon. How can I risk bringing that fate to your door?" Owen cupped her face with one hand, his touch infinitely tender. "First, I don't believe in curses. Second, even if they existed, I'd say, then I'll break the curse." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "You challenge fate itself, for you, without hesitation." Owen smiled, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Life offers no guarantees, Eleanor. Every day is a risk, whether we acknowledge it or not. I'd rather risk everything with you than play it safe without you." Eleanor leaned into his touch, her fears still present but somehow diminished by the certainty in his voice. "I love you too, Owen Harrington, despite my best efforts not to." His laughter warmed the space between them. "I've noticed you can be stubborn that way." His expression grew serious again. "I'm not asking for an answer today, just for you to consider a future where we face whatever comes together, curse or no curse." Eleanor searched his face, finding nothing but sincere devotion there. Slowly, she nodded. "I will consider it." Owen's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. He leaned forward, hesitating a breath away from her lips, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Eleanor closed the distance between them, sealing their declarations with a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When they finally parted, both breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "Well," he murmured, "if that's consideration, I look forward to your final decision." Eleanor laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. The shadows of the past, her 3 husbands, the town's whispers, the weight of loneliness seemed to recede in the warmth of Owen's embrace. A sound at the barn door startled them apart. Martha Harrington stood there, leaning on her cane, a knowing smile on her weathered face. "I thought I might find you two here," she said without a trace of embarrassment at interrupting their moment. "The stove at our place is acting up again, Owen, smoking something terrible." Owen sighed, though his eyes still shone with happiness. "I'll come fix it, Mother." "No rush," Martha replied, her gaze moving between them with obvious approval. "Seems to me you're in the middle of something more important than a temperamental stove." Eleanor felt another wave of warmth rising to her face, but it was accompanied by affection rather than embarrassment. "We were just finishing up here, Martha. Why don't you come inside where it's warm and I'll make us some tea while Owen sees to your stove?" Martha nodded, satisfied. "That sounds lovely, dear. And perhaps while he's occupied with that, you can tell me what you think about a spring wedding. The lilacs would be in bloom then, and they'd make a beautiful backdrop, don't you think, Mother?" Owen protested, though he couldn't hide his smile. "I've only just spoken to Eleanor about my feelings. And judging by what I interrupted, she returns them," Martha replied practically. "At my age, one doesn't have time to dawdle over these matters." As they made their way to the house, Eleanor tucked her arm through Martha's, sharing a glance with Owen over the elderly woman's head, a mixture of exasperation and fondness that spoke volumes about their shared future. Should Eleanor fully embrace it? That evening, after Owen and Martha had returned to their homestead, Eleanor sat alone by her fire, turning recent events over in her mind. Owen loved her. The knowledge glowed within her like an ember warming places that had been cold for too long. But fear still whispered in the darkest corners of her heart. What if the town was right? What if there was something about her that brought misfortune to those she loved? Could she bear it if Owen became the fourth man to die while loving her? As if in answer to her troubled thoughts, a memory surfaced, Owen's voice, firm with conviction. "Then I'll break the curse." Such simple words, yet they carried the weight of his character, his refusal to be governed by superstition, his willingness to face whatever came with courage and determination. Eleanor rose and went to the small writing desk in the corner, withdrawing a worn leather journal. Inside were entries spanning years, including the darkest periods after each husband's death. She turned to a blank page and began to write, attempting to sort through her tangled emotions. "Owen loves me and I him. This should be a simple joy, yet fear clouds it, not fear of him but for him. For what loving me might cost. Thomas, William, Edward, all gone too soon. Is it mere coincidence, as logic suggests, or something darker, as the town believes? Yet when I look at Owen, I see a different kind of strength than I've known before. Not just physical strength, though he has that in abundance, but a strength of spirit that refuses to bow to others' expectations or fears. Perhaps that is what breaking a curse requires, not magic or ritual, but the simple, stubborn courage to live and love fully, regardless of risk." Eleanor closed the journal, her decision crystallizing. She would not allow fear, her own or the town's, to deny her this chance at happiness. Whatever came, they would face it together, as Owen had said. The next day dawned bright and cold, the world transformed by a fresh snowfall that muffled sounds and softened edges. Eleanor completed her morning chores with unusual haste, then changed into her best day dress, a deep blue wool that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair. She hitched her horse to the small sleigh Thomas had built during their brief marriage and set out for the Fulton place, the runners gliding smoothly over the pristine snow. Her heart beat a rapid rhythm against her ribs as the homestead came into view, smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney. Owen was in the yard, axe in hand, a pile of split wood growing beside him. He looked up at the sound of the sleigh bells, surprise and pleasure illuminating his face. "Eleanor, we weren't expecting you until later." She brought the sleigh to a halt and climbed down, suddenly nervous despite her resolve. "I needed to see you." Owen set down the axe, concern replacing his smile. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor shook her head, moving closer until she stood directly before him. "No. Something is right, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Understanding dawned in his eyes, but he remained still, waiting for her to continue. "You said yesterday that you'd break the curse," Eleanor said softly, "that you'd risk everything to be with me." Owen nodded solemnly. "I meant every word." "Then I have an answer for you." Eleanor took a deep breath, reaching for his hands. "Yes, Owen Harrington. Yes to facing whatever comes together. Yes to building a future that defies the past." Joy transformed Owen's face, as bright and pure as the snow surrounding them. "Eleanor," he breathed, drawing her into his arms. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I've ever been about anything," she replied, lifting her face to his. "I refuse to let fear or superstition steal what happiness we might find together." Their kiss was both a promise and a declaration witnessed only by the silent white landscape, and as they discovered moments later, by Martha, who was watching shamelessly from the cabin window. "Well, it's about time," she called, opening the door despite the cold. "Does this mean I can start planning that spring wedding?" Owen laughed, keeping one arm firmly around Eleanor's waist. "It seems you already have, Mother." Martha beckoned them inside, her face alight with satisfaction. "Life's too short to waste, especially at my age. Now come in before you both catch your death in this cold." As they crossed the threshold into the warm cabin, Eleanor felt the last of her reservations melt away. This was what she had been missing, not just love, but family. A sense of belonging that transcended the town's judgment and her own painful history. The news of their engagement spread through Walla Walla like wildfire, eliciting reactions that ranged from genuine congratulations to barely concealed horror. Mrs. Gray made a point of stopping Eleanor after church the following Sunday, her expression grave. "My dear, are you quite sure about this, given your history?" Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I've never been more certain of anything, Mrs. Gray. Owen makes me happy." "But the risk is one we choose to take together," Eleanor finished firmly. "Love isn't safe, Mrs. Gray. It never has been." Not everyone was disapproving. Mr. Wilson from the livery stable heartily shook Owen's hand, declaring, "About time someone showed this town that superstition is no match for a determined heart." Even Sheriff Miller offered cautious good wishes. "Can't say I understand it, Harrington, given what folks say, but you were always one to make up your own mind." "Best decision I ever made," Owen replied simply. As winter settled over the valley, Owen and Eleanor began planning their future together. They decided that Eleanor's ranch, being larger and better established, would be their primary home, while the Fulton place would be maintained for Martha and as additional farmland. The wedding was set for May, when the lilacs would indeed be in bloom, just as Martha had suggested. Eleanor found herself caught up in preparations that she had never imagined undertaking again, selecting fabric for a new dress, considering flowers and food for the celebration, even allowing herself to dream of children that might someday fill their home with laughter. Christmas came, the first Eleanor had not spent alone since Edward's passing. They gathered at her ranch, Owen, Martha, and a few neighbors brave enough to defy the town's superstitions. The cabin glowed with candlelight and evergreen boughs, the air fragrant with roasting goose and Martha's famous apple dumplings. After the meal, as they sat before the fire with cups of spiced cider, Owen surprised Eleanor with a small, carved wooden box. "What's this?" she asked, turning the beautifully crafted object in her hands. "Open it," Owen urged gently. Inside lay a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "It was my grandmother's," Owen explained. "Mother has been keeping it safe all these years for when I finally found the right woman to give it to." Martha nodded approvingly. "I always knew he would eventually, just took him longer than most to find his way." Eleanor slipped the ring onto her finger, finding that it fit perfectly. "It's beautiful," she whispered, overcome with emotion. Owen took her hand, kissing the ring now resting there. "A new beginning," he said softly, "for both of us." As the new year of 1879 dawned, bringing with it lengthening days, and the first hints that winter would eventually release its grip, Eleanor and Owen's plans continued to take shape. They worked side by side repairing, planting, preparing both properties for the spring that would mark the start of their married life together. The town's attitude began to shift as well, if slowly. When Owen and Eleanor appeared together at community events, fewer people crossed to the other side of the street. Some even stopped to chat, curiosity about this man who defied the curse, overcoming their fear of Eleanor's supposed bad luck. Not everyone was convinced, of course. Reverend Porter continued to express concerns about the wisdom of their union, while others made wagers on how long Owen would survive after the wedding. But these voices seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant to the life Eleanor and Owen were building together. One crisp March afternoon, as they were turning over the soil in Eleanor's vegetable garden in preparation for spring planting, Owen paused, leaning on his spade. "I had a strange encounter in town yesterday," he said. "A man I didn't recognize stopped me outside the bank. Said he knew Edward from his days working in Spokane." Eleanor stiffened slightly at the mention of her last husband. "What did he want?" "To warn me," Owen replied, his expression thoughtful. "Said there was more to Edward's death than fever, that I should ask questions if I valued my life." A chill that had nothing to do with the March wind ran down Eleanor's spine. "What is he suggesting? That Edward was murdered?" Owen set down his spade and moved to her side. "I don't know. He hurried away before I could ask more, but it got me thinking about something that never quite added up." "What's that?" Eleanor asked, her throat tight. "You told me Edward died of a mysterious fever. But in a town this small with only one doctor, how many mysterious illnesses go undiagnosed? And why did the town so quickly decide it was part of a curse rather than asking more practical questions?" Eleanor had never considered this perspective. Dr. Whitman said it was some kind of infection he couldn't identify. Edward complained of stomach pains for days, then the fever came, and within a week. She shook her head, the memory still painful. "Stomach pains, fever, rapid decline," Owen repeated slowly. "Eleanor, those could be symptoms of poisoning." The spade slipped from Eleanor's fingers. "Poisoning? Are you suggesting someone deliberately killed Edward? Who would do such a thing?" "I don't know," Owen admitted. "But I think it's worth investigating, if only to put these questions to rest before our wedding." Eleanor stared at the freshly turned earth, her mind racing. Could there be truth to this suggestion? And if Edward was indeed murdered, what about William and Thomas? Had their deaths truly been accidents or something more sinister? "We should speak with Dr. Whitman," she said finally. "And perhaps Sheriff Miller, though I'm not sure he'd take such speculation seriously." Owen nodded, his expression grave. "I'll go into town tomorrow. See what I can discover without raising too many eyebrows." That night, Eleanor slept fitfully, dreams of her past husbands merging with fears for Owen's safety. If someone had indeed murdered Edward, might they not target Owen as well? The thought was too horrible to contemplate. Morning found her pale but resolute. Whatever the truth, she needed to know it. As Owen prepared to ride into town, Eleanor made a decision. "I'm coming with you," she announced. "If we're to uncover the truth about Edward's death, I should be there. I knew him best, after all." Owen studied her face, then nodded. Together, then. Their first stop was Dr. Whitman's office, a small building attached to his home on the edge of town. The doctor, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression, seemed surprised to see them. "Mrs. Prescott, Mr. Harrington. What brings you here today? Not ill, I hope." "No, doctor," Eleanor replied. "We've come to ask about Edward's death last year." Dr. Whitman's eyebrows rose. "Edward? But why? We have reason to believe his illness might not have been natural," Owen interjected smoothly. "I encountered a man yesterday who suggested there was more to the story." The doctor's face paled visibly. "I don't know what you're implying, sir, but I diagnosed Edward with an acute infection. These things happen, especially in remote areas without access to the latest medical treatments." Eleanor leaned forward. "Doctor, please, if there's anything you didn't tell me, then anything at all I need to know, not just for Edward's sake, but for my future with Owen." Dr. Whitman removed his spectacles, polishing them with a handkerchief in a nervous gesture. "Mrs. Prescott, what you're suggesting, it would mean—" He trailed off, visibly conflicted. "It would mean someone in this town is a murderer," Owen finished quietly, "and that person might still pose a danger." The doctor replaced his spectacles, his decision apparently made. "I did have concerns about Edward's symptoms. They progressed unusually rapidly, and there were certain signs that didn't align with typical infections." "Such as?" Eleanor prompted. "The discoloration of his fingernails, the particular quality of his delirium, and—" He hesitated. "When I suggested sending for a specialist from Spokane, someone in town, a prominent citizen, strongly discouraged me, said it would only prolong the inevitable and cost you money you didn't have." Eleanor frowned. "Who would presume to make such a decision?" "Mr. Gray," the doctor admitted reluctantly. "From the bank." Owen and Eleanor exchanged glances. Mr. Gray, husband of the town's most vocal gossip and moral guardian. The connection seemed tenuous at best. "Why would Mr. Gray involve himself in Edward's medical care?" Owen asked. "Edward worked at the bank," Eleanor reminded him. "Perhaps Mr. Gray felt some responsibility as his employer." Dr. Whitman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There was also the matter of the loan." "Loan?" Eleanor repeated. "What loan?" "Edward took out a substantial loan from the bank shortly before his illness," the doctor explained. "I assumed you knew." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "He never mentioned it to me. What would he need money for? We were managing well enough." The doctor shrugged helplessly. "I cannot say. But perhaps this information provides a direction for your inquiries." Their next stop was the sheriff's office, where they shared what they had learned. Sheriff Miller listened with growing concern. "These are serious allegations, Harrington," he said when they had finished. "Accusing a man like Herbert Gray of murder, even indirectly, could have grave consequences." "We're not accusing anyone yet," Owen clarified. "We're gathering information. But you must admit, Sheriff, the circumstances warrant investigation." Miller stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "I suppose I could look into this loan business. Bank records are private, but if there's suspicion of criminal activity—" "That's all we ask," Eleanor said. "If Edward was murdered, the killer must be brought to justice. And if he wasn't, if it truly was just illness, then we can put these doubts to rest before our wedding." The sheriff studied them both. "Very well. I'll make discreet inquiries, but I advise you both to keep these suspicions to yourselves for now. If there is a murderer in Walla Walla, the last thing we want is to alert them to our investigation." As they left the sheriff's office, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. The possibility that Edward had been murdered was horrifying, yet it also offered an explanation beyond a supernatural curse for the tragedies that had befallen her. "What now?" she asked Owen as they walked toward their wagon. "Now we conduct our own investigation," he replied quietly. Starting with the bank. Herbert Gray, proprietor of Walla Walla's only bank, was a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and an air of self-importance that seemed to fill his small office. He greeted them with barely concealed disdain. "Mrs. Prescott, Mr. Harrington. What brings you to the bank today? Surely not a loan for wedding expenses." His chuckle held no warmth. "Actually, Mr. Gray, we're here about a previous loan," Owen replied smoothly. "One made to Edward Prescott shortly before his death." Gray's jovial expression froze. "Bank business is confidential, sir. I'm afraid I cannot discuss customers' accounts with third parties, even widows." "I am Edward's heir," Eleanor pointed out. "Surely that entitles me to information about his financial affairs." "The loan was secured against property that was not part of your joint holdings," Gray said stiffly. "Therefore, it does not concern you." Owen's eyebrows rose. What property would that be? Edward owned nothing apart from what he shared with Eleanor. A flicker of unease crossed Gray's face. "As I said, bank business is confidential. Now, if there's nothing else, there is one thing," Eleanor interjected. "Dr. Whitman mentioned that you discouraged him from sending for a specialist when Edward fell ill. I wondered why you would involve yourself in my husband's medical care." Gray's face reddened. "I was merely looking out for your financial interests, Mrs. Prescott. Specialists are expensive, and with Edward's condition deteriorating so rapidly." "How did you know his condition was deteriorating?" Owen asked quietly. "According to Dr. Whitman, the only people who knew the severity of Edward's illness were Eleanor and himself." The banker stood abruptly. "I think this conversation has gone far enough. I must ask you both to leave. I have important business to attend to." Outside the bank, Owen and Eleanor conferred in low voices. "He's hiding something," Owen said. "The question is, what? And how does it connect to Edward's death?" Eleanor added. "We need more information about that loan." Their opportunity came unexpectedly the next day when a young clerk from the bank, Timothy Collins, approached them as they were loading supplies at the general store. "Mrs. Prescott," he said nervously, glancing around to ensure no one was watching. "Could I speak with you and Mr. Harrington privately? It's about Mr. Gray and your late husband." They retreated to the relative privacy behind the livery stable, where Timothy shared what he knew. "Edward discovered discrepancies in the bank's accounts," he explained in a hushed voice. "Money missing from several prominent customers' deposits. He confronted Mr. Gray privately, believing it must be a clerical error." "But it wasn't," Owen guessed. Timothy shook his head. "Gray had been embezzling for years. Small amounts that wouldn't be noticed, but they added up. When Edward realized what was happening, Gray offered him a partnership in the scheme. Edward refused and threatened to expose him. So Gray created this fictional loan," Eleanor said slowly, "to discredit Edward if he went public with his accusations." "Yes, madam." "Made it look like Edward had borrowed the missing money himself. But Edward kept careful records of what he'd found. He told me he'd hidden the evidence somewhere safe, in case anything happened to him." Owen's expression hardened. "And then he conveniently fell ill and died before he could expose Gray." Timothy nodded miserably. "I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid. Mr. Gray has influence in this town and I need my job, but when I heard you were asking questions..." He straightened his shoulders. "Edward was kind to me. He deserves justice." "Do you know where Edward might have hidden these records?" Eleanor asked, her mind racing. "No, madam. He was cautious, said the fewer people who knew, the safer the information would be. After Timothy left, Owen turned to Eleanor. Where would Edward hide something he didn't want found? Somewhere he considered safe, but accessible to him. Eleanor thought hard, trying to put herself in Edward's place. Not at the bank, certainly, and not at home where I might accidentally discover it and be put at risk. Her eyes widened with sudden realization. The cemetery. Edward used to visit Thomas and William's graves regularly, said he felt a connection to them, having loved the same woman. The perfect hiding place, Owen agreed. Somewhere he could visit without arousing suspicion. Somewhere connected to you, but that you were unlikely to disturb. That evening, under cover of dusk, they made their way to the small cemetery on the hill overlooking town. Edward's grave lay beside those of Thomas and William, all three markers simple but well-maintained. If I were hiding documents, Owen mused, studying the area, I wouldn't bury them where the ground would be disturbed and noticeable. I'd use an existing structure. They examined the headstones carefully, finding nothing unusual. Then Eleanor noticed something about William's stone, a slight looseness in one of the decorative finials that topped the marker. "Here," she said, wiggling the stone knob gently. It came away in her hand, revealing a small hollow inside the top of the headstone. Owen reached inside and extracted a tightly rolled bundle of papers, waterproofed with waxed cloth. "Clever man," he murmured, carefully unwrapping the documents. By the light of their lantern, they examined Edward's meticulous records, dates, amounts, account numbers, all documenting Gray's systematic theft from the bank's customers. The final page was a letter addressed to Eleanor, explaining his discoveries and his intention to bring Gray to justice. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, I fear the worst has happened. Herbert Gray has been stealing from the bank's customers for years. When confronted, he threatened not only me but you as well, implying that your history of losing husbands made you vulnerable to suspicion. I cannot allow his crimes to continue, nor can I risk your safety by remaining silent. I plan to take these records to the territorial judge in Spokane next week. If anything should happen to me before then, please ensure these documents reach the proper authorities. Know that I have loved you truly, and that the happiness you brought to my life was worth whatever price I may pay. With deepest affection, Edward." Eleanor wiped away tears as she finished reading. "He was protecting me, and Gray killed him for it," Owen said grimly. "Likely some slow-acting poison that mimicked natural illness. We need to take these to Sheriff Miller immediately." But as they turned to leave the cemetery, a voice stopped them. "I'll take those papers." Herbert Gray emerged from behind a large monument, a pistol gleaming in his hand. Behind him stood his wife, her face a mask of cold determination. "I knew you'd figure it out eventually," Gray said, gesturing with the gun for Owen to hand over the documents. "The widow and her curse-breaking cowboy, how touching." "It was you," Eleanor said, sudden understanding dawning. "All along, it was you, not just Edward, but William and Thomas too." Mrs. Gray laughed, a brittle sound in the cemetery's silence. "My husband may have handled Edward, but the other two were my work. Couldn't have the town's most eligible property owner happily married, could we? Not when Herbert needed access to more capital for his investments. The schoolteacher was easy," Gray added callously. "A little tampering with his horse's saddle before a storm, and the minor mining accidents happen all the time." Owen's hand tightened on Eleanor's arm, whether in restraint or support she couldn't tell. "You've been systematically isolating Eleanor, killing her husbands, and then spreading rumors of a curse to keep others away. Also, you could eventually force her to sell her ranch when she could no longer maintain it alone." "Business is business," Gray said with a shrug. "Nothing personal. Now, the papers, if you please. Then we can discuss how this unfortunate situation will be resolved." "You mean how you'll kill us both and make it look like another tragedy befalling the cursed widow?" Owen's voice was steady, but Eleanor could feel the tension in his body. "I don't think so, Gray." Before Gray could respond, a new voice called from the cemetery entrance. "That's far enough, Herbert." Sheriff Miller appeared, his rifle trained on the banker. Behind him stood Deputy Jones and Marshal Thornton, both armed. "We heard everything," the sheriff continued, advancing slowly. "Timothy Collins came to me this afternoon with his suspicions, and we've been watching the cemetery since sunset, waiting to see who might show up." Gray's face contorted with rage. "This is absurd. You take the word of a clerk and a cursed widow over mine." "I'm the most respected businessman in Walla Walla." "And a murderer 3 times over," Marshal Thornton added coldly. "Drop the gun, Gray. It's over." For a terrible moment, Eleanor thought Gray might shoot anyway, taking her or Owen with him into death. But Mrs. Gray, ever practical, saw the futility of their position. "Herbert," she said sharply, "do as they say. There's no sense adding to our troubles." The fight seemed to leave Gray all at once. He lowered the pistol, allowing Deputy Jones to take it and bind his hands. As the Grays were led away, Sheriff Miller approached Owen and Eleanor. "You two took an almighty risk coming out here alone." "We had to know the truth," Eleanor replied, still clutching Edward's letter. "All these years, I believed I was somehow responsible for their deaths, that I was cursed." "The only curse was having neighbors like the Grays," the sheriff said grimly. "They'll face trial in Spokane, away from any influence they might still have here. Given the evidence and what we heard tonight, I'd say they're destined for the territorial prison, if not the gallows." In the days that followed, the town of Walla Walla reeled from the revelations about the Grays. The bank was temporarily closed while auditors examined the accounts, and many who had shunned Eleanor found themselves struggling to meet her eyes, ashamed of how readily they had accepted the cursed narrative. Reverend Porter delivered a sermon on the dangers of gossip and false witness, though he carefully avoided directly mentioning Eleanor or the Grays. Mrs. Holloway made a point of inviting Eleanor and Owen to tea, as if years of whispered conversations could be erased by cucumber sandwiches and forced pleasantries. For Eleanor, the truth brought a complex mixture of emotions: grief for her husband's, now known to be murdered, anger at the years of isolation she had endured, but also profound relief that the shadow of the curse had been lifted at last. "How do you feel?" Owen asked her as they sat on her porch one evening in late April, watching the sunset paint the newly plowed fields in gold. "About the town, about everything that's happened." Eleanor considered the question carefully. "I feel free," she said finally. Free to grieve properly for Thomas, William, and Edward, knowing they were taken by human malice, not some supernatural judgment. Free to love you without fear that I'm bringing you under the same dark cloud. Owen took her hand, his thumb tracing the outline of his grandmother's ring. "And the town, they'll come around or they won't," Eleanor said with a new confidence. "Their opinion matters far less to me now than it once did." Owen smiled, drawing her close against the evening chill. "Have I mentioned lately how much I admire your strength, Eleanor Prescott? Most people would have broken under what you've endured." "Perhaps I bent," she acknowledged, "but you helped me straighten again." She turned in his arms to face him. "When you said you'd break the curse, you actually did, just not in the way either of us expected." "By stumbling onto a murder conspiracy," Owen chuckled. "Not exactly what I had in mind." "By refusing to accept what everyone else took as truth," Eleanor corrected. "By asking questions when others were content with superstition. By believing in me when I barely believed in myself." Owen's expression softened. That was the easy part. 3 weeks later, on a perfect May morning with lilacs perfuming the air just as Martha had predicted, Eleanor Prescott and Owen Harrington were married beneath the ancient oak tree in Eleanor's now their front yard. The entire town turned out for the occasion, some from genuine goodwill, others from curiosity or a desire to make amends. Eleanor found she welcomed them all equally, her happiness too complete to leave room for grudges. Martha, resplendent in a new gown of lavender silk, played the role of both mother of the groom and mother of the bride, fussing over Eleanor's dress and Owen's tie with equal determination. Timothy Collins served as best man, his stand against the Greys having earned him not only the town's respect, but a promotion at the newly reorganized bank. As Owen and Eleanor exchanged vows before Reverend Porter, their voices clear and confident, a sense of rightness settled over the gathering. This was no cursed union, but a beginning built on truth, courage, and a love strong enough to withstand the darkest suspicions. The celebration continued well into the evening, with tables set up under lantern light and music from a hastily assembled band of local musicians. As the night deepened, Owen led Eleanor away from the festivities to a quiet corner of the garden where they could hear the distant laughter but enjoy a moment of privacy. "Happy, Mrs. Harrington?" he asked, arms encircling her waist. "Completely, Mr. Harrington," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you?" "Beyond words," Owen murmured against her hair. "Though I must say I'm looking forward to when all these well-wishers go home and leave us in peace." Eleanor laughed softly. "They mean well. And after years of avoiding me, I suppose I should be grateful they're so enthusiastic now." Owen's tone suggested he was less inclined toward forgiveness than his bride. "Still, I didn't expect quite so many to stay quite so long." A voice interrupted their moment. "There you are." Martha approached, slightly unsteady on her cane after sampling the wedding punch. "The guests are asking for the bride and groom. Time for one more dance before we send you off properly." Owen sighed, but his eyes twinkled with affection for his mother. "Very well, but just one. Eleanor and I have waited long enough to start our life together." "Indeed you have," Martha agreed with surprising solemnity. "Through darkness and doubt and danger. That's how I know you'll weather whatever comes next. You've already faced the worst and emerged stronger." As they returned to the celebration for a final dance, Eleanor looked around at the faces of friends and neighbors, at the ranch that had sustained her through loss and loneliness, and finally at Owen, whose love had helped transform a cursed widow into a joyful bride. The town had called her cursed after 3 husbands passed. A cowboy had said, "Then I'll break the curse." And in the end, they had broken it together not through magic or defiance of fate, but through the simple, powerful act of seeking truth and refusing to surrender to fear. As Owen drew her into his arms for their dance, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, joys or sorrows, triumphs or challenges, they would face it together, their love stronger for having been tested in the crucible of the past. 1 year later, as spring once again transformed the valley around Walla Walla, Eleanor sat in the rocking chair on the porch, watching Owen and Martha in the garden below. The elderly woman was directing the planting of new rose bushes with the authority of a general commanding troops, while Owen followed her instructions with good-natured patience. Eleanor's hand rested protectively on her rounded belly, where their first child, a son, she was certain, though Owen insisted it would be a daughter, had been growing these past 7 months. The doctor predicted an August birth, when the summer heat would be at its most intense, but Eleanor found she didn't mind the prospect. This ranch had seen enough of death. It was time for new life to flourish here. The past year had brought changes beyond their marriage. The Fulton place was now a thriving extension of their operation, with a tenant family working the land under Owen's direction. The bank, restructured after the Grays' conviction, had approved a loan for additional livestock and equipment. And the town, true to Eleanor's prediction, had gradually come around, though she suspected it was as much due to the sensational trial of the Grays as to any genuine remorse for their treatment of her. Herbert and Margaret Gray had been convicted of 3 counts of murder and numerous financial crimes. They were currently serving life sentences in the territorial prison, their fine home and possessions sold to repay the customers they had defrauded. It was a stunning fall from grace for the couple who had once been Walla Walla's social arbiters. As for the curse, it had faded into a cautionary tale that parents told their children about the dangers of jumping to conclusions and spreading harmful gossip. Sometimes, Eleanor caught people watching her and Owen together, as if still half expecting some tragedy to befall them. But as the seasons passed uneventfully, even these lingering superstitions began to fade. Owen looked up from his work, catching Eleanor's eye across the yard. His smile, still as warm and genuine as the day they met, sent a familiar flutter through her chest. How strange and wonderful that after all she had endured, happiness should find her again, more profound than she had dared to hope. Martha said something that made Owen laugh, the sound carrying clearly in the spring air. Eleanor smiled, grateful beyond words for this family they had created, unconventional perhaps, but bound by love and loyalty stronger than any blood tie. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across their land, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a widow believed cursed to a wife and soon to be mother, from isolation to community, from fear to courage. And all because a dusty cowboy had walked into a general store one autumn day and declared, against all reason and superstition, "Then I'll break the curse." Some curses, Eleanor had learned, weren't supernatural at all, but human-made chains of fear and judgment. And some cowboys, one cowboy in particular, possessed the rare courage to break those chains and set a heart free. Owen was climbing the porch steps now, wiping honest soil from his hands, his face alight with simple joy at the sight of her. "Martha's determined to have those roses blooming before the baby comes," he reported, kneeling beside Eleanor's chair to place a gentle hand on her belly. "Says every child should be welcomed into the world with flowers." "Your mother is a wise woman," Eleanor replied, covering his hand with her own. "She is that," Owen agreed. "Though don't tell her I said so. She's already convinced she knows everything." As if on cue, their child kicked against their joined hands, a strong, definitive movement that made them both laugh in surprised delight. "See," Owen said softly, "already agreeing with me. This child is going to be as stubborn as its mother." "And as kind as its father," Eleanor added, leaning forward to kiss him. Together, they watched the sunset paint their land in gold and shadow, secure in the knowledge that whatever came next, whether joys or challenges, they would face it as they had faced everything since that first meeting. Side by side, breaking curses with every step.